Hello, friends, and welcome. Tonight's story takes us into a northern forest where silence stretches longer than expected, and the echoes of our own voices can take on a life on their own. So, get yourself something to drink, get a blanket, and snuggle up. They called it Birch Hollow. From a distance, the white trunks of the birches rose like pale pillars against the grey sky. The valley smelled of damp earth and rain, and the wind moved cautiously through the trees as if it too was listening. Jonas carried his pack of microphones and recorders, walking slowly along the narrow dirt road. He had come to capture the natural soundscape for a documentary series, to preserve the subtle voices of the forest. The cabin he rented stood near the edge of the hollow, small and weathered, its wood dark against the pale trunks outside. He set his equipment inside, checking levels on the microphones and the parabolic dish, placing recorders on rocks where they could catch the softest rustle of the leaves. The forest outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt measured, patient, almost expectant. That first evening, Jonas sat in the cabin, leaning back in the wooden chair by the small window. Outside, the birches swayed gently in the evening wind, and the last pale light filtered through the branches. He poured a glass of mulled wine, cheap, but enough to feel warmth in his chest, and set the bottle on a table beside the recorder. He put on the headphones and pressed play. At first, it was just the hollow. Leaves shifting, a distant drip of water, soft wind moving through the trees. Then his own voice came through, clear and ordinary. Ambient check. 1, 2. He frowned. The last syllable lingered, stretched slightly, as if something had picked it up and bent it. He paused, replaying it again. The syllable returned, the emphasis just a little off. He shook his head. Maybe it was the mic. Maybe it was a reflection of sound in the hollow, but it didn't feel right. Jonas sipped the mulled wine, letting the warmth anchor him. He tried another test, speaking softly. Check 1, 2, 3. The sound came back. Check 1, 2, 3. Warped and delayed. Not exactly repetition, but not independent either. His heart quickened, a small knot of unease settling in. He removed the headphones for a moment and leaned back, listening to the room. The faint creak of the cabin settling, the wind against the walls, the rustle of leaves outside. When he pressed the headphones back over his ears, he whispered, "What are you?" The reply was subtle, carried in the hollow of sound itself. Not words he could quite place. He froze, gripping the chair's arm, feeling the weight of the silence around him. For the first time, he noticed how still the hollow really was. It wasn't just quiet, it was listening. By the second day, the hollow's responses grew more precise. When Jonas clapped his hands or spoke in short phrases, the echoes returned with shifts in timing or emphasis that made him pause. It was as if the forest was imitating him, but also interpreting him. A simple word became something else entirely. Stretched vowels, flattened consonants, a tiny delay that turned the phrase into a new meaning. He tried to rationalize it. Acoustics, reflections, quirks of the terrain, but the patterns were too consistent. They responded to him, sometimes correcting him, sometimes reshaping his voice in ways that felt intentional. He could hear the faintest hint of breath between the echoes, the smallest inflection he had not given. By the third day, Jonas felt compelled to explore deeper into the hollow. He carried 2 recorders and the parabolic dish along the winding paths between the birches, noticing details he had ignored before. The moss that clung to the north side of the stones, damp and dark, faint depressions in the earth that suggested someone or something had walked here long before him. The air seemed heavier the deeper he went, and the usual forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, distant bird song, had thinned, leaving a quiet that pressed close to his ears. Eventually, he came upon a shallow circle of stones. The ground at its center was worn smooth, almost polished, as if generations of footsteps had flattened it. Jonas knelt, running a hand over the cold surface, and felt the faint trace of grooves, shallow lines that hinted at a deliberate pattern, though their meaning escaped him. He placed the recorder carefully on the largest stone, aligning the microphones to catch every nuance of sound. He spoke into the hollow with the same routine phrases he had been using all week, testing the equipment and unknowingly himself. But the responses were no longer just echoes. They had changed. The forest seemed to fold his voice in on itself, returning it warped, slowed, stretched in subtle ways that suggested awareness. Words that had no meaning came back with almost intentional inflection, like a language half-formed, imitating him, yet shaping themselves differently. Sometimes a pause would arrive just as he exhaled. Sometimes a consonant would linger, prolonged, almost anticipating the next sound he might make. Jonas's unease grew. The deeper he listened, the more he felt the forest pressing in, its presence no longer distant. He leaned closer to the recorders, whispering questions he did not expect to hear answered. Who are you? Where do you come from? The words felt fragile in the thick, damp air. Yet, each reply returned with a weight that made him shiver, as if the hollow had absorbed more than sound. It had absorbed him. He noticed little things that set his teeth on edge. A branch creaked somewhere out of view, though the wind stirred it. A leaf fell, silent, unnaturally still in its descent. The shadows between the birches seemed darker, deeper, moving ever so slightly when he blinked. Each response from the recorders now carried the sense of consciousness lurking just below, beyond comprehension. Patient and watchful, noting the rhythm of his speech, the way he paused, the sound of his breath. By evening, Jonas could no longer tell where he ended and the hollow began. He sat on the stone, leaning forward. The recorders balanced in front of him and pressed play on the last test. The playback returned his own voice, layered and thickened, trailing into extra silences and half-formed sounds. He whispered another question, almost in desperation. "Are you still there?" The hollow answered, not with words, but with a long, low vibration. A folding of sound that lingered in the space between trees, in the soil beneath him, in the very air around his head. It held memory, attention, and some subtle, intangible recognition of him. Jonas's pulse raised. Goosebumps prickled his arms. The forest had become patient and alive, holding him there, listening and knowing. When morning came, the cabin seemed ordinary again. The path showed only deer tracks and faint impressions of foxes. Jonas was gone. The recorders remained near the stones, cables tangled like roots. They contained every phrase, every hesitation, every pause and echo, the full trace of his presence, and enough subtle distortions that anyone who listened afterwards would feel, as he had, that something in Birch Hollow had been pressing, quietly but deliberately, against the edges of understanding. And when someone played the final recording, long after he had disappeared, the echo returned one last time, clear and deliberate. "I was." It was neither reassurance nor threat, just acknowledgement, quiet and unyielding, a presence that had existed and perhaps still did.